was born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama. I graduated from the University of Alabama, and all my formative years as a young person were spent in Alabama. And I still have family and friends there. And as I say in the last line in my book, I am haunted by my past, and that past is my past in Alabama and the racism that I experienced and lived through and write about in my book.
My impression of the South and newspapers in that period when your parents were publishing Our Southern Home, that there would have been some subjects that would have been very difficult to write about.
Oh, that's very true. You could not write about segregation, for instance, in any real sense, especially if you had somewhat liberal feelings or problems with segregation.
Yeah.
You'd be castigated by the community. I have one sample I can give you of that. In 1949, early 1949, my father wrote a series of editorials in his newspaper that decried the emergence of the Dixiecrat Party in Southern politics. That was the party that bolted from the 1948 Democratic National Convention and ran Strom Thurmond as their presidential candidate, who carried 4 or 5 southern states. In spite of that, of course, Truman upset Thomas Dewey in that election and was reelected. But Dad's premise in the editorial was that the Dixiecrats were doing a disservice to the South and to the Democratic Party by the positions they were taking. And I left Livingston years ago and continued to think for years that my father was quite liberal in his racial views. When I finally saw and read these editorials completely, I discovered that he certainly was more liberal than the average white Southerner at that time. He was not the liberal I thought he was. Just paraphrasing, he wrote in one paragraph in one of the editorials that race was not the issue that he was putting on the table in these editorials. It was just the debate between the Dixiecrats and the Democrats for control of the party. And Southerners didn't have to worry because the good senators Lister Hill and John Sparkman and the House of Representatives member Edward de Graffenried would make sure that our Southern way of life was protected. Well, those were just code words for segregation and keeping segregation in place.
Oh, the South that you grew up in Montgomery and Livingston was segregated. I would imagine, though, that there were a lot of, or some anyway, occasions or instances in which black people and white people did mix. I mean, that black women worked in white homes, or there were some workplace situations. So it wasn't as totally as apartheid as one might think.
Oh no, it wasn't separate in terms of the two groups, blacks and whites, working together. I mean, we can look at the book and movie The Help, that's been so popular the last couple of years. While I think that story is glamorized a bit in its telling, certainly in fact, I enjoyed the movie more than the book, but that's another story. But yeah, they work together all the time. It's another example of when people work together in small groups or as individuals, they tend to get along quite well. It's when our little tribal groups start growing in size and getting at loggerheads with one another that the problems come about. We all had black women and black men working for us, either in our homes or in our businesses. I played, 2 of my best young playmates were 2 young black boys, Willie Jr. and Yank. And it was quite acceptable, an unwritten rule in the South that young boys could play together, black and white, until puberty and high school. And then the dark curtain of segregation fell back into place between you two.
Right.
And when I was in Livingston in April, I inquired about Willie Jr. and Yank, and they're both dead. I so much wanted to be able to talk to them and meet them again, because it's been 60 years since I last saw them.
So, Waights, I've heard you talk about your experiences in the South and about your book, and much of the time your emotions are very close to the surface, and you become very passionate when you talk about the subject. Is that?
Well, that's very true, and I am passionate about it, and I'm basically an emotional person. But there are passages in this book that I've been reading and rereading since I wrote them, and reading them in numerous book readings and signings that I've done since last October when the book came out. And frequently I can't get through them without getting emotional and even maybe tearing up a little bit, because the stories are either so moving or so heart-rendering, and they tear at my gut.
Yeah. So you do. I'm guessing that you have some conflicting feelings about the South as home. That there's some pride about the home, and there's some real sadness about the history and what went on there.
Oh, you're right on both counts. I've lived in California and on the West Coast the bulk of my life. I've lived out here since, I started working at Boeing in Seattle in 1959, and have lived on the West Coast all but 1.5 years since that period. So I'm, in that sense, more West Coast than I am Southern, except that we're all so inbred in our roots, in the sense of where we're brought up and what we experience and learn as young people. And I hearken back to Kill a Mockingbird and Young Jim as an example. And that's an example of what my life was like in Livingston, what I experienced, and how it sculpted the person I came to be. So I still love my state. Having said that, I'm constantly apologizing for it. Most recently, they passed this harsh immigration law, which I just find awful. They are apparently, the legislature's reworking it and trying to tone it down, because there's been so much backlash, not only nationally but within the state, about it. But we'll see how that plays out. In spite of their protestations to the opposite, it's another example of racial discrimination against another group of people. In this case, it's Mexicans, and in the past it was African Americans.
Yes.
In the first part of the 20th century up to the early 1960s, any change in the South, be it for the better or worse, certainly anything for the better racially, moved at a glacial pace, snail pace, just dribbled along. And it wasn't until two events occurred in the early 60s. In 1963, 4 Ku Klux Klanners bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church that killed those 4 young black girls. And I read that episode, I cannot read it without tearing up. I can hardly talk about it without tearing up. That moment was the moment that forced the Kennedy administration to start drafting what became the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Till that time, Kennedy, with a few exceptions, had held hands off and let the states take care of these problems, which is what the states, of course, wanted to continue. Kennedy, of course, didn't end up signing the bill. Lyndon Johnson did when Kennedy was assassinated. Then in '64, the Selma Voting Rights March took place from Selma to Montgomery, where several heinous events took place, murders and killings, beatings. Out of that came the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which Lyndon Johnson, and quite frankly, maybe only Lyndon Johnson, could have gotten through the Congress because of his knowledge of Senate procedures, etc., etc. and his arm-twisting capabilities. From that moment forward, it was as if a mass tsunami of change swept over the South.
Uh-huh.
Because in the next 10 years, the schools were desegregated, sports were desegregated, all the white colored signs came down, all the public places were desegregated, and change moved forward at an incredible pace. To me, that's an example in our democracy of what the federal government can make happen for injustices when it finally takes action.
Yes.
And if they hadn't, the South would still be twiddling along. Now, the changes I've observed, the one I mentioned earlier, that college in Livingston, which was all white when I lived there, is now over 50% African American. I gave 2 lectures there. Half of the people in the lecture group were African Americans.
Yeah.
Very interested. Few of the African American kids came up to me after my talk and said, "Mr. Taylor, I didn't realize how bad it was."
Uh-huh.
Well, these are kids whose parents lived it, or grandparents certainly.
Yes.
But then you think, when I was their age, 18 to 20, 50 or 60 years ago was the early part of the 20th century. Events that happened then, I became aware of, but my connection and understanding of them depended upon what level of education I got. So the subsequent generations lose contact with what happened earlier. And that's why it's so important to keep telling these stories and reinforcing them.
Right.
The other changes I observed were the ease with which blacks and whites get along in the South. It is truly remarkable.
Uh-huh.
And it even was years ago, except when the Ku Klux Klanners would come swinging around doing their ridiculous things. But much more so today. There's even, in the early part of the 20th century, there was a large migration of African Americans to the West Coast and the North.
Mm-hmm.
And a recent book by Isabel Wilkinson, I think's her name, covers that subject very well. There's actually a reverse migration going on now where African Americans are moving back to the South. Part of it's to do with the economic problems we've been having of late. They're finding opportunities in the South they can't find elsewhere.
Uh-huh.
And they're certainly more comfortable coming back home.
Yeah. Yeah, so I was remembering the 50s and early 60s when there was talk about integration. And I remember that people who were against integration, people who were in favor of keeping the races segregated would say, well, they would say, like, to a man who had daughters, do you want your daughters to marry black people? Like, that was like the critical question that was supposed to...
That was the litmus test, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and there were also laws against black people and white people getting married. It was illegal.
Miscegenation was illegal.
Yeah, couldn't mix. So, my guess would be that with the integration that's happened, or the breakdown in segregation, it's not total, but
Oh no.
that there's really very little marriage between the races.
Well, I'm going to take difference with you on that and cite a statistic that was in the newspapers when I was in Alabama recently. Alabama is one of the states with the highest percent of interracial marriages in the United States now.
Uh-huh.
And so that's another measure of the change. And in a sense it doesn't surprise me because there's such a large African American population in the state that it's inevitable. And of course, even in the segregated periods and the slavery periods, there were consensual and demanded sexual relationships between the races, which resulted in a number of children being born and then propagating children beyond. So that one of the things I write in my book, that when you meet an African American person, wherever you are, and certainly in the South, you have to pause and reflect, am I related to this person?